If people in ancient Rome were not concerned about the environment, it wouldn't be here. Or if they had the means to destroy the environment, it would be dying. So the time will come that people will feel the consequence of our actions now. And a barrel of petrol is equivalent to the work it does for us, for my car, is equivalent to 11 people working for you for a whole year. Well, that's a convenience thing for us. But who's going to scrub the atmosphere to remove the CO2 that's going to burn our descendants? So unless we consider the real cost of things, then it cannot be thought that we are acting morally as it concerns our descendants.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the social impact of conscious companies and everyday heroes. Hear inspiring stories from those who put people and planet before profit and personal gain. You'll learn how you can make a difference, vote with your dollars, and get involved today. Here's your host, Karina Belizzi.
Hello, fellow do-gooders and friends. I'm your host, Karina Belizzi. Today, as we come back from our holiday break and enter what will be our fourth year of this podcasting journey, I'm thrilled to bring you on a deep conversation with an acclaimed neuroscientist about a beautiful story that he wrote. This is a work of fiction. Now, the one that explores perhaps some crazy ideas, that seeks solutions, and that inspires us to work for more meaningful change together. Now, this isn't the first time that I've interviewed authors of fiction, the eco-fiction authors as it would be, about the power of their craft to push for real meaningful change. We have explored through a futurist's perspective on the topic of surrender when I hosted a discussion with Lee Schneider. And then there was Juliet Rose, whose works of fiction have helped us to understand addiction and battling those addictions through sometimes other unhealthy habits, throwing ourselves into hard work and fighting fires in California, creating new traumas in their wake, and really the connection to our ecology and what we do as a people to surmount some of these challenging times, the climate change crisis that we confront. This may not be the last time that you hear a story like this, in fact. Now, we also would remember a more recent episode in which I interviewed Isabel Reddy. And Isabel constructed an entire work of fiction around a coal mine disaster in Appalachia that occurred in the 1970s and that ended the life of so many people who worked hard to build that town, that holler. So today, as we get started with this new season, we are poised to ask perhaps different questions that connect to the ethics of scientific exploration and the incredible challenges that we face with this climate crisis. How might these two worlds intersect? That's exactly what we'll explore. Now, the questions that we pose. What if a modern day geneticist were to discover what could be the bones of Christ and have the skill set, the resources, and the will to both extract that DNA and clone him, not just once, but twice? This story comes from someone that I would call an unlikely storyteller. He's an acclaimed scientist who studied at Berkeley, McGill, and Yale, and who was a visiting scientist at Cambridge, Oxford, Stanford, UCLA. He is Scientia Professor of Medical Sciences at Neuroscience Research Australia and the University of New South Wales in Australia. He's identified and named more brain areas than anyone in history and published 57 scientific books. His first, The Rat Brain and Stereotaxic Coordinates, is the most cited publication in neuroscience and for decades the third most cited book in all science of all time. His name is George Paxinos, and he joins me today to talk about his first work of fiction, a page-turning novel called A River Divided, which was published on October 31st, 2023 by Heads and Tails. I have so many questions for George Paxinos, and I'm sure you do too. I'll do my best to cover the bases. George Paxinos, welcome to the show.
Good day, Corina. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I share some of your passion for a better world, for archaeology.
Well, that's something that we got to talk about before I brought you up, that I actually have a background in archaeology. So this main character that you explore, we're going to get into that quite a bit. But first, I would really love for you to tell us what moved you from your world of academic writing, 57 works, and so much more. What compelled you to write this work of fiction, which I understand was decades in the making?
It was decades in the making. Just before submitting it, a friend of mine found me working on it at a coffee shop in Bondi Junction, a suburb of Sydney. And she asked, as usual, how is the book going? And I said, 21 years, and I'm still not finished. She said, my cousin's novel was published posthumously. I said, you're giving me hope. And what moved me to work on a novel, it was failure leading to fiction in my case. I tried environmental activism, and things I tried failed. That is, protecting trees, forests, protecting the tramway legacy of Sydney for the future advent of a light rail system. And I thought, if only I could write a novel and work not on behavior, not trying to stop someone who wants to cut a forest, but to make them want to preserve the forest. That is, work at attitude, upstream, the origin of behavior, then I could be more effective. But I didn't have the vehicle. I couldn't come with an idea. For a decade, I was thinking of this until one point, one of the many pre-Christmas parties that we have in Australia, where summer coincides with Christmas, a friend said, I notice you're going to Spain, and there you should go and see San Juan de Compostela, where the bones of St. James are buried. But I'll get some DNA and see what the guy looks like. And then I thought, why not someone far greater? And this, what a book is about, it asks the question, what would someone with the genetic endowment of Christ do if he was born today? Would he join Wall Street or street protests? And it's a neuropsychological approach of Christ. I had trouble finding a publisher. The first publisher I approached asked me, what is this book about? And I said, well, it's a travel diary. It has to do with human cloning. It's about resurrecting Jesus. It deals with ethics. It is about the environment, principally about the environment, but has philosophy as well. And he said, and on what shelf would I place it? And until that moment, I was convinced of Woody Allen's saying, if you are a bisexual, you double your chances for a rendezvous on a Saturday night.
Well, as it stands, I can understand part of what the publisher's dilemma is. It's who is the audience for this book? And frankly, I think it is a work of ecofiction, but it is also, it really sits at that juxtaposition of the question of nature versus nurture and what really makes us individually who we are, which is, I think, one of the most compelling questions that we ever have the will to ask. There have been so many twin studies. And so you're ultimately posing the question about that twin study. What if you were to make a clone? And that clone was someone who we had documented some of their life. They existed 2,000 years ago and were known as the virgin birth or the son of Christ, the son of God, rather, right? Now, you made a couple of choices in this story, too, that I think make it really interesting in another way. And that was that Evelyn, while she was a lover of Christ, wasn't exactly a devout Christian.
In fact, only because she was an atheist, she could, or at least not a Christian, she could contemplate the idea of finding the remains. All Christians believe that there are no mortal remains. So she had to be a non Christian, in her case, an atheist.
And I think, too, there's also this question of, the roots in Israel where she's finding the bones. Like, this is very early in the story, so I don't feel like I'm giving too much of a page turner. Too much of the story away yet, right? Because it's so early in the story. But finding them in a relatively open space and then worrying, going through that entire worry that they may be discovered and that her plans could be thwarted because she has this desire to do this thing of deeply questionable ethics, which is to bring Christ back into this world in what I really think would be the first true virgin birth in a way, because it's, It's not like there's an insemination by another sperm. It's a creation from something of the past. Was that intentional? Was that part of your weaving of this story? Why did you make that choice in creating this work?
Right. That is, well, I wanted to have someone genetically, and as you pointed out, the influence of the environment to use the psychology I knew, the neuroscience I knew of identical twins raised apart come into play. In that way, the book is fiction presenting facts. In that neuroscience was what I knew and I could write. The aim was to bring the environment into play, and choosing Christ was deliberate. That is of all other philosophers, because the early Christians certainly produced a big change in civilization. They took over the Roman Empire. There was a new ethic, and this and more is required before we construct a sustainable society. Now, as to what symmetry exists there with the birth of Christ, which of course is not, according to the protagonist who produced the cloning, is not a case of virgin birth. It's just a birth like any other, though the person, the philosopher, was unusual, and she chose Christ rather than any other one because, again, the change society, the total shift that we will need to have. But there is, of course, some symmetry in the sense by the time the reader reaches the end, we realize that one of the twins will find himself in the same position his foster father was. He will be a foster father as well. So there is a plot that comes in full circle. The issue of nature versus nature that you mentioned, psychologists, of course, now say it is nature via nurture. And much like two artists would sculpt different statues from the same block of marble, different environments will sculpt different characters, even with the same DNA, even with identical twins, as we have the case in the book.
So, in this case, you're exploring the story of an affluent couple in Sydney bearing the child, Evelyn, in fact, having this child, raising it in that space, and then another individual that they solicit to have the child on their behalf in another space in South America with no real financial security and seemingly on the run for fear of discovery, right? So there's this layer of kind of another added intensity to one individual's life, and then an exploration of what happens with their moral character as a result of that. Now, I was very curious as somebody who is an anthropologist myself and was trained in archaeology and explored these topics many times throughout, about whether your perspective at all changed in the writing of this story as you continued to do your research. Did you think it was nature more or nurture more at the beginning, or did you truly understand it to be a combination of both nature via nurture, as you just said?
Yes, though there would be, I used psychological evidence of identical twins raised apart, where you can expect some common traits, but you could expect that the environment will produce variations in them. The evidence, for example, for schizophrenia in most identical twins is that 50% chance if the proband, if the first one that you meet is schizophrenic, you can predict that 50% chance the other twin, the identical twin, will be schizophrenic. Similarly, with sex preference, that is, homosexuals, if are identical twins, if one is homosexual, the probability is 50%, the other one will be, it's not 100%. So the environment plays a significant role. So I used the psychological evidence for that. So I had from the beginning the idea of what can be expected. Usually, of course, you can have variability in anything, but the reason that I attempted this is because I had the psychological background for it, and of course, out of interest, I had the environmental science, the data for all that.
So like any great novel, this story does have a big conflict. And I think the two conflicts in this story are this potential of these two Christ figures or possible Christ figures meeting one another, because that question's always there, right? Do we believe what Evelyn believes? Is this a recreation, a clone of Christ, or is it just some other random person from 1800 or more years ago? So that question is left to our imagination, never a firm answer, because how could you firmly answer that anyways, right? But at the same time, we have that piece of conflict. But then the other big bad really has to do with our environmental collapse and things that we're doing in the name of green energy in the Amazon. And so you have this central conflict in the story. And this is where the meaning of the book title, I think, really comes in, this concept of a river divided, right? We have two individuals that could potentially be on opposite sides of a story. We also have the outcome that relates to the Amazon. Are we going to dam it and continue this deforestation, or are we going to let the land stay its wild and beautiful self and preserve its future for the generations that follow and for the health of tomorrow? So I wondered if you could, for a moment, talk to me about why you chose this conflict in particular over another conflict, and what does it really mean to you?
That's right. Well, the Amazon is an iconic asset of the earth, and I actually wanted both siblings, identical twins, to have a leg to stand on. That is, we don't have the saint and the devil. For different reasons, they were supporting opposing actions. One of them wanted to construct green energy, renewable resources. Uh, so from the river, and the other one was opposed to it because it was going to make the river downstream poor in oxygen, and a number of fish species would not be able to cope. Besides having a limited time span, and afterwards leaving the river with siltation and a huge loan to Brazil. So they both have some reasons to act the way they do. It suited the story to have a divided river because you do have a division between the two brothers. And the embryo itself was accidentally divided in half when Evelyn, the protagonist who constructed the clone, accidentally divided it in two, and both halves kept their cell division. So she had two embryos, giving birth to one, and the other one she could not, and she gave it to a surrogate in Argentina. So there is that division of the embryo. There is the identical twins, two of them. So yeah, the story, the divided river, suited, besides of course being the an iconic asset of the earth.
Well, I have to say, I found it to be a truly picturesque story, because those that decide to pick up a copy, and I think most should, frankly, this is basically offers you the opportunity to explore from a story perspective a lot of the topics that we've covered on this show. When we had Steve Hawley on this podcast, as a for example, and we interviewed him about his work Cracked, which is all about the crumbling infrastructure of dams and why dams are actually a bad thing for ecosystems. This story works to tell you more about the reasons behind that and an entertaining perspective. So you're not just sitting there reading the scientific journal, so to speak. And sometimes I think our brains need that kind of a break. I personally found that I really enjoyed that exploration. I also really liked this perspective that Jose, we can call him the Jesus of South America if we want to, right? For this case, he is actually speaking about the brain, as his mentor happened to also be somebody in the neurosciences. And he uses this metaphor, essentially saying that our brains aren't actually the right size for the solutions that we would seek to create. Like basically, we don't have the capacity to understand the unintended consequences that our actions will have. And because we don't have that capacity, we need to stop. And I have often felt this in a very real, rudimentary way in my bones, in my being, in my gut, in my soul, when I hear about things like, the government doing experiments on an island off the coast of Hawaii in the rain shadow of Hawaii and choosing to do something like introduce a rabbit because they want to get rid of some grass that is growing there. And then they figure the rabbits are just going to die off after they eat all that grass, right? Because there's no water source. Well, guess what the rabbits started doing? They started eating the eggs of the seabirds because the eggs had moisture to them. So they were getting their water by eating the eggs of the seabirds that are endangered. And then to get rid of the rabbits, they introduced dogs. It just got worse and worse. It was like the story of the little old lady who swallowed the fly, right? And these are really smart people working on these problems. These are really smart people and scientists working on these problems. And yet we can't solve the most basic of them.
Well, and in the case of the environment, Corina, the producing a sustainable society, which assume everyone would like to see, is going to be a far greater challenge than it's thought so far. If I can bring my 8-year-old granddaughter to this, I asked her, tell me something that you will do today that does not pollute the planet. She said, running. I said, that's good, but if you run, you will wear out more shoes than otherwise. Then running barefoot. I said, that is good, but if you run, you build up your appetite and they will have to slaughter more chickens to bring them to you to eat in trucks. She said, sitting in a chair. I said, that's very good, but to make a chair, you have to cut a tree. Then lying on the ground naked. It is hard to think of something that you do today that does not pollute
Right.
the
This is
planet.
one of my friend's arguments against recycling. She said, I didn't have children. And I'm like, well, you got me there because I had two.
Well, that's right. People should have to go to that extent. I mean, we are entitled to have our children, but not. The problem is not assisting those who do not want to have additional children, not to have them. This is family planning, and this is really where we find the institutions, such as the religions, are working against survival. The Enlightenment was the concept of it is that you do not follow dogma, but science. And it's exactly the opposite that is happening now with a number of religions. And this is taken up by one of the protagonists in the novel, Jose de Olmos, who asks the question firstly on, his question is about equality. And he said, tell me the difference between these two sets of groups of people, Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, and on the other hand, Nightingale, Marie Curie, Mother Teresa. And the answer to which his brother gave was ordination. The first three can apply to become priests in the Catholic Church. The other three need not apply. And the church deals with the environment no better than it treats women. That is, if you look at it, they consider prophylactics which could assist people to plan their family and not to have so much like 80 million people additional coming to the planet unwanted. It interferes with this. They consider prophylactics to be more evil than HIV, from which they can protect you and, of course, assist you to have your family, to plan your family. So, unless religions get out of the bedroom of people, we will continue to have a problem with population because whatever else you do, if you have twice as many people, you'll have twice the problem, other things being equal.
So, as we think about this story as a whole, I'd really love for you to share what you hope that people will take away from this story and carry with them as a resounding message to perhaps inspire them or keep them thinking. What is it that you hope that they will leave this story thinking about?
Well, I'll just tell you what my aim was to have a reset of religion, science, and culture. Of course, my book will be ignored, much as most books are ignored, but my aim. Now, what I hope they will understand humility, that is, that we are not as clever as we think. That is, the brain is a limited organ that produces limitation, cognitive, emotional, motivational limitations, and that it is not that far different from the brain of the chimpanzee, which I also studied. In fact, I wrote to the Taronga Park Zoo in 1980 and requested the opportunity to be given a chimpanzee brain once a chimpanzee died. They responded they would be happy to oblige, but they had not had a death of a chimpanzee in the zoo for a decade. 2 months after receiving my letter, 3 chimpanzees died. Luckily, they didn't suspect me.
Well,
And
see, you and I have
I
something else in common here. I actually, in my undergrad, had the pleasure of helping to, well, I worked on one of the chimpanzees that had passed in nature that Jane Goodall had studied. So, had been kept in cold storage for a couple decades, frankly, because I went to college in the late 90s. But she had a very close friendship with Adrian Zillman, who was my professor of primatology, and I was an assistant in the lab. And so I got to work on a desiccated formalin soaked skeleton and work to prepare it, which was a very tedious process. But now that skeleton is part of the learning of the students of primatology at UC Santa Cruz, and I believe it was Flint's skeleton. So, a famous chimpanzee for those who study Jane Goodall's work. So similar, and it's the more that you study them in life, I think the more you start to understand how little difference there really is. Like we have the ability to think on a somewhat different level, but they would never think to damage their living environment in a way. They would never think to pollute their environment. They don't think about modifying it in the way that we do. They see the pastoral beauty of their environment and they work to be a part of it as opposed to separate from it. And that's something that we've learned to do differently than they have. So, the question of what makes us uniquely human has been one that I continue to question.
Well, that's right. This human exceptionalism is not justified by science. That is, if you look at Darwin, he placed us where we belong. And as it concerns the brain, because I studied in parallel the human brain with that of the chimpanzee brain, in whatever else, Corina, you resemble the divine. As it concerns your brain, you're made in the image of the chimpanzee. If only we understood that structurally the brains have no difference. The human brain is larger.
But
Probably
also getting
that's the
smaller,
reason
right? Like it's
that
actually getting smaller over the generations too now.
well, let's come to this in a second. But firstly, the chimpanzee brain is 600 grams. Ours is 1,300. Now, as to whether the brain is getting smaller, would be simply the outcome of who is procreating more. If the large brain people, well, of course, to start with, the size of the brain in humans within us, that is, doesn't have a big role on intelligence. Has some, but the correlation is very small. You understand what I mean? You don't predict variability, as they say in science, by just checking uh, whether your potential partner, has a large hat, right?
I wear a
Uh,
large helmet.
so
We joke about
uh,
this in my household all the time.
yeah. So there is some correlation between our size, the people who have larger head, and intelligence, but not a large correlation. All right, significant but not large. But amongst species, that is 600 grams to 1,300 grams that our brain is, that is chimpanzee 600 more than twice our brain. That seems to be what makes the difference, and you're talking to a human and not to a chimpanzee. But it also gave rise to a hubris that we have never since Narcissus looked at the reflection of his face on a river and fell in love with it. Has there been such an adoration of a bodily organ as there is now of the brain? And never with such little justification for it. So the human brain is an exception compared to our size, unexpectedly large, but the giraffe neck is far larger than what our brain is large in relation to the chimpanzee brain. And you don't have the giraffes committing hubris that they are godlike creatures because of their big neck. So we have a specialization, but we have to understand it in the scheme of things. That is, in that the issues that the book examines as one of the heroes in the book, Jose de Olmos, examines is whether the brain is the right size for survival. If it were smaller, as you pointed out, the chimpanzee is not undermining its subsistence. It would not have split the atom. It would not have produced airplanes that pollute the skies, extracted fossil fuels, overfished the oceans. If it were larger, it might have understood the problem, even solved it. It's just not the right size. And you might say, well, what is the right size? What is the Goldilocks zone for the brain? The Earth is in the Goldilocks zone around the sun. Much closer, and it would burn. Much further, it would freeze. It is in the Goldilocks zone. What is the Goldilocks zone of the brain? I would suggest that in the book that this goes into this, that if it were a bit larger than the chimpanzee brain, so that it will give us some quality of life, so that we don't live like troglodytes, but not large enough to split the atom. Then you get into difficulties. So the book asks an examination of ourselves. There was an engraving in the pronaos of the temple of Apollo in Delphi that said, "Know thyself." Let's understand who we are, that we are not intellectually, emotionally, motivationally as strong as we think we are. Of course, the evidence is all around us in wars, but also in the way we damage the earth. If we only understood that, we would stop constructing mouse traps. We are mice constructing mouse traps as it concerns the environment. So, yeah, that is the question. The brain, we have to understand our power and refrain from things that will construct the conditions for the extinction of our own progeny. If there was anything, and again, one of the heroes in the book says, if there were any immoral thing, it must be that this generation constructs the condition for the extinction of its own progeny in a terrestrial inferno. So refrain, understand who we are, and refrain from constructing the
You know,
mousetraps.
I think that you have become a philosopher.
They've called me
Well,
worse, Corina.
this is something that I've seen in artists and authors and scientists all over the world, it seems. It's like once you get to a certain point in your learning, you see patterns beyond what you expected in the beginning. Like you may have initially been focused on the myopic and identifying each of these interesting parts of the brain, but then once you get to see the picture as a whole, then suddenly the meaning of everything you've learned to date starts to change. And I think that's what I'm seeing here in you.
Yeah, indeed. I started with philosophy actually at Berkeley, and then I was attracted to experimentation, which I did for 50 years. But then, yeah, I've come in some circle again. And really, yeah, philosophy can reflect on things in a more holistic way, that science produces the pieces of the puzzle that you have to assemble. In my case, it was really working with the brain, holding it in my hands, and understand that this 1.3 kilos of meat of neurons and other cells is actually all there is, and that it is the product of the environment, much as many evolutionary scientists have said in such an elegant way. Dawkins and
Well, I
others.
would love to have another conversation with you about your work specifically around the brain. My work in the professional field is in the space of omega-3s, and so I've studied, for instance, how fats impact the brain, and half of the fat in the brain being DHA specifically and omega-3, and then how some of these challenges that we face as we age may also be related to the nutrition that we're putting in and the things that we're not getting because we're eating artificial foods or highly processed foods that are not meant to really be in our diets in the first place. Then also the story of the gut-brain axis and kind of the brain that lives in the gut and how these things talk to each other. I'm so curious about your perspective in these things.
Yeah, well, that's right. Neuroscientists have not cured any disease, but they are not altogether useless. They have identified factors that predispose you to earlier onset dementia than otherwise, one of which is diet, actually, one of the three. The first one coming up in most studies as the most significant is exercise, physical exercise, that is, walking, running, swimming, rowing, cycling. The other one being diet, as you mentioned, and of course, processed food has additional burdens on it.
Or if you have, like
The less
myself, I have
processed,
a
the better.
representation of the ApoE4 genome type, which is negatively associated with brain degradation with time. So, or positively associated with it. It's a negative, but, it means that I'm more likely to develop dementia or Alzheimer's if I don't have my lifestyle right. And the lifestyle definitely plays a role too. So,
Absolutely, but the most depressing thing on this issue is that the most significant factor, that predictor, that is the greatest predictor of whether you will develop dementia early, is your birth status. If you are born poor, then you are out there on your own. And that starts, of course, from the intrauterine environment, that your mother would not have had the appropriate diet, might have been smoking, and continues forever. How many knocks you'll get on the head, what medical care you will receive, all of them are impacting as to whether you will develop earlier or later. Education, the number of years you study. Of course, in science, it's hard to distinguish what is the cause, the consequence, or the coincidence, and you don't know whether somebody might argue that you were not smart enough to go to university. That's why you develop dementia. It's not that the university protected you, but the correlation is strong that it's probably that education, if you can afford it, if you can be motivation itself, if you can have the motivation. And incidentally, motivation itself is environmentally caused, as the book describes. In other words, you can blame poor people. They don't want to help themselves. The issue
I
is,
mean, I laugh at that
oh,
because it's just the more you learn about cultures around the world, it definitely isn't that. You have access to food, you have access to resources, access to good education. I mean, we recently even had a wonderful individual on this podcast who has gone through the rigors of a higher education and getting her JD and everything else out of a northern Ghana, really, where they didn't have a lot of access to education. And so Rosalinda, through ChemFed, got access to these resources and was able to then go and get her higher education and is now going back to that community and helping other people to rise up too. And so it isn't that we don't have the innate ability, it's that we don't have often the opportunity. And it's so easy, I think, when you come from the West to take a lot of that for granted. I mean, I know, George, I think you said your name is Yorgos because you're Greek, right? That's correct. But I'm looking at the title of the book and it says George Paxinos, and I know Paxinos is Greek, but you come from a part of the world that has a deep, long history of education, and I mean, from Socrates to present, right? But there's opportunity in Australia that doesn't exist in certain parts of Africa or in like the the slums of even different spots in the United States where people just don't have the same upward mobility. You could say they should bootstrap themselves up all day long, but their mom's working night shift in addition to taking a day job, or, there just isn't as much opportunity around them. They don't see examples of people in their community succeeding. And so by not seeing examples, they're kept back too. I actually really liked how your book tackled that too, because what they saw instead, or what in Jose's case, what he saw was activism and something that inspired him to learn more and to keep reading, and the power of the written word to educate him. And so, the many books that he had in his room, and how some of those books were even the same that were on his twin brother's shelves in a community that was well educated. So improved access is, I think, the message, right?
Yeah, exactly. And really, if there's anything unfair, if we think we need to give, if we claim that we want to give equal opportunity, all people are created equal, well, from the moment even of conception, you have discrimination if you're poor. Poor people contract dementia earlier. That is, if you look at the Aboriginal population of Australia, who is disadvantaged from historical reasons. Initially, they were really neglected or mistreated. And now you have the situation where they contract dementia 11 years earlier than the non-Aboriginal population, and they die about 11 years earlier. And when recently with COVID, all people above 70 were locked in Australia. You cannot go out above 70, except Aborigines above 50. In other words, 20 years earlier, the government looked for the Aborigines. In other words, they are more vulnerable. And so this is an admission that things are not working yet. The government tries now, but there's a long way to go to bridge that gap in health, including mental health, including that is dementia. So the injustices that people suffer from the beginning. That is, it's not that they have equal opportunity. There's a huge gap in opportunity, even in postponing your dementia. I do not know why the poor people do not stage a revolution. The discrepancy between rich and poor is large enough to justify it, I
Well,
think.
it was enough in the
It's just
past
not
for us
fair.
to initiate revolution. It
Yeah,
definitely
that's
was enough
right.
in the past. And
Yeah,
I feel like it's coming too, but then,
yeah,
you have a pandemic and suddenly people are under control again. Wonder that, right?
yeah,
Fear
yeah.
does a
Well,
pretty good job of
the
controlling
pandemic.
people, and so, I think we need to control our fear too. So I wonder, I have I think this is my last question for you before I offer you the floor to close. Do you think that you're ever going to write another work of fiction? And if so, what might it be about?
My next book will be entitled How to Write a Novel in Less Than 25 Years. This is I have said what I wanted to say, and I have returned to science. I'm happy to give lectures as my contribution to disseminating things that I've through my journey, found through my journey in science, but no, don't have that time
Yeah. Well, you've
available.
already written, now it's what, 58 books in total? 59?
Getting to yeah, it should be 60 by the end of this
Yeah.
the coming
Wow.
year.
Well, continue your great work. As we close the show, I like to ask my guests what I call my final question, and sometimes it leads to another one or two. But is there a question that I haven't asked that perhaps you wish I had? If there is, you could ask and answer it. Or if you have a closing thought that you'd like to leave our audience with, I'd love to offer you the floor.
Yes, that consider the hubris, the human hubris, that we consider ourselves made in the image of God. Just consider what happened to Sisyphus. The ancient gods were not uh, kind to the mortals who compared themselves to the gods. And I told my 8-year-old granddaughter again this story of the king of Corinth, who was condemned by the gods to push a rock, Sisyphus, to push a rock straight up the hill, only for it to fall down again and have to do the same job the next day, because he was narcissistic, egotistical, and insulting. And my granddaughter said,
Or
like
Elon
Trump
Musk.
or Elon Musk.
Some of the richest people in the world can be like that. It doesn't mean they have to be, but it certainly sounds like it's descriptive.
Yeah, and just to have humility, understand our place in evolution, see if there's anything unethical is what that which we are doing now. That is that we are undermining the existence of future generations and construct a sustainable society, which presumably will have to be a world government. I know some people are allergic to the concept of United Nations, but how else are you going to prevent these conflicts and see some egalitarian and to steer the ship through those big problems? We haven't had a war between California and Nevada. And that's the way it should be if you have a world government, neither between Victoria and New South Wales in Australia. The states do not fight with each other. And that's the way we'll have to consider a possible way out of this impasse of having the tragedy of the commons, which again you will find the concept you would have found it in the book, the tragedy of the commons, that these things held in common tend to degrade. The atmosphere is for everyone, and therefore nobody looks after it, and the oceans likewise, which only a superordinate organism can do this state. And I like the experiment that they started in Europe where the borders fell. But then I could imagine other countries accruing to that unit and then having a world government like that. But then people started dismantling it. To consider what will happen, not in until the end of the century, which is expected the temperature to rise between 2 to 5 degrees, which is really likely to end civilization as we know it. But to look even beyond what's going to happen, because if people in ancient Rome, were not concerned about the environment, we wouldn't be here today. Or if they had the means, if we were to destroy the environment, today we would be dying. So the time will come that people will feel the consequence of our actions now. And a barrel of petrol is equivalent to the work it does for us, for my car, is equivalent to 11 people working for you for a whole year. Well, that's a convenience thing for us. But who's going to scrub the atmosphere to remove the CO2 that's going to burn our descendants? So unless we consider the real cost of things, then it cannot be thought that we are acting morally as it concerns our descendants. And finally, if I may wish your audience for their brain to shrink less than expected for their age.
Yes. Well, I have to invite you, your ghost, to listen to an episode I recorded with Paula DePerna. She wrote this book called Pricing the Priceless, which is all about pricing the cost of these common resources, from the oceans to the atmosphere. She actually studied alongside Jean-Michel Cousteau. Jacques Cousteau, she actually worked for Jacques Cousteau. And then through this weird connection, I actually ended up spending some time with Jean-Michel Cousteau and inviting him on the podcast too. So I'm an ocean health advocate, and that's part of that journey. But ultimately, I'm here to support our climate health and the longevity of all people and the preservation of our planet. And I think the only way forward for all of us is to do so in a way that respects the common man and that respects mindful use of resources without thinking that technology is simply going to save the day, because I think we have too many examples where it's failed. And so, frankly, it's because our brains are probably not the right size. Right?
Know thyself.
Yeah.
Know thyself is not as silly as it might look, not a slogan as it
Yeah.
might seem.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I've truly enjoyed it, and I think our audience has likely come along for this journey wanting to read your book, A River Divided. And I know that this is available by Yorgos, spelled George Paxinos, wherever books are sold. I know you can find it on Amazon. Is there anywhere in particular you'd like them to go to find this book? Is there a preferred place?
No, Amazon is fine. And if they want the audiobook, they can write to me. They'll find my email. It's easy. And I'll send them a link to the audiobook.
Wow, audiobook. Well, I would have enjoyed that, so perhaps I'll hit you up for that too. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Karina, it has been a pleasure. I hope we speak again.
Certainly will. I'll invite you on my other podcast to talk about brain health. What a pleasure to have the opportunity to meet with an acclaimed neuroscientist and one who has taken up the helm of philosophy and answering some big questions through the work of his fiction in a simple and beautiful book, A River Divided, available now wherever books are sold. Now, to learn more about George Paxinos, or Yorgos rather, and his important work, visit the link that you'll find in our show notes. And for my complete transcripts, along with our expanded blog with links to the episodes and books that we discussed during today's podcast episode, visit our website, caremorebebetter.com. That will be linked directly in show notes as well. And while you're there, I hope that you'll subscribe to our newsletter, which will gain you access to a free gift. It's a 5-step guide to unleash your inner activist. That could be used for climate activism. It could be used for a project that you're working on. It really is a thinking resource with some helpful links to get you started. It was ultimately the culmination of some of my work in my graduate degree for my MBA. Now, while you're there, I hope that you will also give me the benefit of the doubt and subscribe for future episodes if you haven't already on whatever platform that you're listening on. You could give us a thumbs up, a 5-star rating, or even write us a written review. Each of these actions helps the podcast to grow, reach more people, get more great guests, and ultimately continue on this journey. Now, if you are listening on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, leaving a review there really helps us. So thank you so much in advance for doing that. I do read every single one. So if you want to go ahead and recommend a future guest, you can even do that in the written review, or you can send me an email note from my website or simply by sending a note to hello@caremorebebetter.com. Thank you now and always for being a part of this pod and this community, because together we really can do so much more. We can care more, we can be better, and we can even dream up a better world for tomorrow so that we can live and thrive together for generations to come. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for social good. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and share with your friends to help us reach more people and spread more social good.